So hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining. I'm Sarah Jones. I'm one of the members of TAB, and today myself and Gretchen are going to present an overview of what happened at Plenary 19 based on the Plenary Pathways and summary slides that we received from the different groups. So there are 3 TAB members who are involved in organising these sessions, myself and Gretchen, who'll present today, and then also Minfang Wu from ARDC, who was involved in the earlier session that we ran this morning, or this morning European time. Who knows what time it was in other parts of the world. And as I said, we're going to give an overview of P19, and it's really trying to highlight the key outcomes from the different sessions. And we've structured that according to the plenary pathways. So when people submit session proposals, they pick one or more pathways to help kind of organize the program. So hopefully many of you had attended RDA either in person in Seoul or maybe remotely, but it was an incredible hybrid plenary this time, very successful, and a very diverse international participation. So there were people from 50 countries, over 827 participants from different regions of the world, and very good support from the local organizers. And what we're going to focus on today is all of the rich session content that happened in all of the breakouts. So overall, there are 9 plenary pathways, and we're going to present them in 2 blocks, and we'll have time for discussion and comments in the middle and also at the end. The first ones are around fair, care and trust. So first off, picking up the principles, and then the second pathway is looking at the adoption and implementation of those principles. And then there's 3 pathways that cover data infrastructure and environments, and those are the ones that Gretchen will present. One's covering institutional, regional or disciplinary, and international. And then the final pathway in the first block is around training, stewardship, and data management planning. And then after a little bit of discussion, we'll pick up on the other pathways, which are around data life cycles, semantics, and discipline-focused data issues. What we did is we asked session organizers to provide a summary, just like a 1-slide summary of the key highlights and outcomes from their sessions. And in this visual, you can see the summaries we received. So that's the ones in orange. There were many more sessions, and that's why I flagged that we aren't going to be able to present on everything because we couldn't attend all the sessions. We focused on where we'd received summaries. And all of those summaries are actually very useful. They're available on the Google Drive, and we can hopefully put that link in the chat, and then you can pick up and look at those individual summaries. And these slides are also available already. I think they're linked to in the collaborative notes. In terms of how the sessions split across the different pathways, there were some pathways that had many more sessions than others. So the fair, care and trust ones were both very high numbers, and also the data infrastructure, particularly in the international context. There were actually only 4 sessions that picked other, and all of those sessions had also picked one of the thematic pathways. So when we describe them later, we've put them into the relevant pathway rather than covering them under other. And another interesting thing to flag here is just how many BOFs there were. There were BOF sessions in every pathway, and some of those pathways had a lot of BOFs. So you can see there's quite a lot of emerging practice in certain areas, like around the data life cycles or the international data infrastructure. There was also one community of practice. This is a new concept for RDA, and it will be interesting to see how that develops and how other COPs get set up. One thing to flag here is that most of the sessions chose 1 or more pathways. Some of them chose 2 or 3, and we've just reported out on them wherever it was most fitting. So you'll only see them covered once, and you might see in the index slides for each pathway, you'll see things grayed out. And that means that either we've presented them elsewhere or they didn't provide a summary. And just a huge shout out to Minfang. She did a lot of work creating this index for us, which made it a lot easier to produce the summaries that we've done. So what we'll do in the hour we have today, we'll present a synthesis per pathway and pull out some common themes. And then after each batch, we've got 2 kind of batches of pathways. We'll have time for discussion, but by all means put things in the collaborative notes as we go through as well. So I'll start us off with the fair, care and trust, and there are 2 pathways here. The first one on principles, there was actually 17 sessions under this. There are a number of working groups, and the ones at the top are the ones where we've received a summary and will report out. And there were also interest groups and a couple of BOFs. So overall, if I can click to the slide, there are 4 session summaries we'll give here. In terms of CURE, one of the key things that came out of their group is that there's a new output that they're looking for adoption of.
My friends too.
10 things for curating reproducible and fair research. And there was also a new output in the research software group. I don't know if you can mute whoever's speaking there. The FAIR Principles for Research Software has come out, and they're going to be maintaining that output through the related interest group. So they're both useful things. The links are available in the slide, so do look at those outputs. They might be relevant for your own work. The VRE group had a really interesting discussion about how to implement FAIR in the context of VREs. And one of the conclusions they drew was that there isn't actually a standard for VREs, and that they're quite far off a reference architecture. So there's quite a lot of work that they're wanting to develop in that group to see how they can enable FAIR through the VREs. And then the final group here, the BOF on privacy implications of, the interest group on privacy implications of research data sets. This group reactivated at Plenary 18.
Let's just see what I can do about getting out of your head.
And I don't know if anyone's able, who's the host? Hillary, are you able to mute whoever's speaking? This group was reactivated, and they're essentially planning their work. So they're trying to redefine privacy in the context of research, and also doing work to develop vocabularies and expand the FAQ.
Not what I do.
So some of the common themes, it was first understanding how to define and understand FAIR in different contexts. So FAIR is not just about the objects. We're looking at also fairness of VREs and repositories, and looking at FAIR for different types of research outputs like software. And then looking at the role of services in enabling FAIR. So how services can help by minting DOIs, assigning licenses, using vocabularies. Obviously, because this is inherent to FAIR, there was a lot of focus on vocabularies and standards and the need to work on new definitions. And this was actually a bit of a common theme. A few groups picked up that different types of users needed very different metadata. So you need to know who it is you're pitching at when you're developing either your schema or developing the different principles. And because a number of these groups had also created new outputs, there was quite a lot of focus on promoting and adopting those outputs. The second plenary pathway here in terms of FAIR was about the adoption and implementation. This had more sessions, 26 in total, and we got summaries for quite a number of them, both the working groups and the interest groups. And then there were also BOFs. We got summaries for half of the BOFs. We're actually only going to report on 3 of them here because many of them are reported out on in different pathways. So the 3 that you can see highlighted in green are what we'll report out on. In terms of the interest group on data policy standardization, they were looking at journals' data availability statements and how we can make those more useful, better quality. And because they're thinking about the FAIR context, there was an emphasis on trying to make those machine readable as well as being standardized. The sharing code group, we're looking at the importance of sharing analysis code alongside publications, and the need to do a lot of advocacy to researchers and publishers to try and generate the culture change there. This was a BOF, so they're looking at how they could potentially set up a new group. And then the final one we're reporting on was also a BOF, which was about dataset quality. And they wanted to look at essentially how we assess data quality, what the community interests and needs are to manage quality information, and also to share that in a multidisciplinary context so that we can get that cross-disciplinary reuse and understanding about whether a data set is of good quality. So the common themes across these, I think because they're about the implementation and adoption, there was lots of use of use cases and stories to try and understand and test areas of work, and also a requirement to work across different discipline or national contexts. I know FAIR is often understood in one particular discipline because the standards are focused in that area, but when we're trying to work across the board, you need to look for commonalities and to build from those. So a lot of the groups were focusing on that. Again, there was a highlight in these groups that there's a very big difference in what different types of users need. So the need to tailor outputs to a specific context. And then, as I noted, some aspects like machine readability came up for FAIR, and the need to address data quality issues as well. So I'll hand over to Gretchen to cover the data infrastructure pathways, and there are 3 here she'll pick up on.
Thank you, Sarah. Very nice beginning to this summary of sessions. So yeah, if you recall in one of the earlier slides, the data infrastructures and environments, there's 3 different pathways and we clustered them together. The first of those pathways, institutional, had 9 sessions, and there were actually 4 BOFs related to institutional data infrastructure, a joint session, and a couple working groups. So we had a few session summaries provided with those shown here. The next pathway related to data infrastructure environments, that's regional and disciplinary science areas. And again, a couple more BOFs in this area, a working group, another joint session, and a few interest groups were reported out. We had this actual pathway had really good output in terms of sessions. So kudos to this pathway area. And then the last of the pathways in this infrastructure and environment area, international, had a large number of sessions, 17. We had a few sessions here, which you see listed, and the Global Open Research Commons, they had a couple sessions that they reported out on. So, and again, 3 more BOFs. So this overall, this area with infrastructure and environment has a lot of activity in it. There were 15 summaries. The 8 listed here that are grayed out, these are reported out in some of the other pathway summaries, so we won't go into that. And then these 7 listed here in blue from the breakout sessions, it's a mixture of working group, interest groups, and BOF outputs. We're gonna just go into a little bit more detail for their summaries. So yeah, the Global Open Research Commons, they have come up with one of their outputs is a topology, and I haven't actually seen this. I think it's a hexagon that identifies different categories for how they're going to think about common space, and they're going to publish this. And in addition to the categories, they're looking at going into detail on the definition of them. And also, there's this how-to guide that they're planning on generating along with this. It's layered and fits within this topology category description. The next summary session related to physical samples, they are moving forward with this RDA output known as the 23 things of physical samples. And I don't know if you've glossed over it. It's pretty interesting how they've broken out how to characterize what it means to have physical samples. And they're also looking at how you would, associate citation with physical samples and refer to them in publications. So there were some preliminary guidelines that were output by the ESA physical samples cluster that they also shared out in their session. Then moving on, the Earth, Space, and Environmental Sciences, they had a very nice detailed session summary where they are looking at different types of data infrastructures and coming up with a catalog for semantic resources in their infrastructure space. They're also looking at formats for citations that are more complex in nature, and looking at how they're going to coordinate their working group with other kinds of scholarly publication and data preservation systems. So there's an emphasis in this session on the planetary sciences and the informatics generated. Just a second, let me move something. Okay, moving forward. These are the last set in the infrastructure report out. So the research data architectures and institutions, you're going to see this theme reappear in a future pathway, but they're looking at integration with high performance computing, high throughput computing with data management systems and services, and what are different workflows there. And this concept of how do you design off-ramps from these workflows? This may be how do you want to dispose of data, or how do you want to move from one part of the workflow to other services? So I like the quote that they included in their session. It is not enough to simply build bigger buckets of infrastructure. They also emphasize you need expertise and understanding how to handle the data. The BOF on research data spaces taxonomy. This is a fairly new area, and they talked a good bit in this session about what is the nature of data spaces and the taxonomy, which describes, related to data spaces, and how does that compare with data commons. And there's multiple use cases out in the health data areas, and they want to look at exploring this further, maybe under this use case context, looking at differences and similarities with data commons. There's then the data management plans, machine actionable data management plans. They have this acronym that they've come up with, and I think they looked into, for this session, what does it mean to have a machine actionable DMP? And they're also thinking about how can they set up and host a hackathon to look at this and test out interoperability if you have these machine actionable data management plans. And one of the other last summaries that we're sharing out with this pathway grouping here is looking at, this was a joint session between a couple interest groups, repository platforms, and then domain repositories. And how do you share knowledge and exchange data across data repositories, cross-disciplinary data repositories, and what are some of the challenges there? And they're also explored in their outputs, what are the differences in practice across disciplines? And they wanted to work on areas of improving repository capabilities for cross-disciplinary work, and how do you communicate that out to people that are producing the data? And some of the common themes that came out of data infrastructures and environments is obviously repository workflows within the infrastructure, and how do you integrate these data infrastructures with both the internal services, but also external services and new capabilities. There's a growing interest in integrating infrastructures that cross boundaries between compute, software, and data. and looking into how citation is integrated within infrastructures. And there's different levels of complexity and how people are pursuing citation. Along with integration, there's also more richer interoperability. This cross-disciplinary repository work obviously has some challenges for interoperability. And then the emerging area of data spaces and commons and intersections between those two. Semantics comes into play in infrastructure, and how do we communicate out the new concepts that are being discussed and shared out in these pathways.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Gretchen. Yeah, I think it's a very rich set of pathways there, lots of interesting sessions.
Indeed.
The final one we'll cover before we pause for some discussion and questions and comments from you is training, data stewardship and Dmps. Now, within this block, this pathway, there were actually 11 sessions. You can see the ones at the top in green that we'd received a summary from the different working groups, interest groups and BOF. So it's around half of them, but we're actually going to only report out on 2 because 3 have been covered in their pathways and also others. So the 2 that we'll report out on here are around professionalizing data stewardship. This group, like many others, has got lots of outputs. It's been very active. They've been developing data stewardship models and understanding the training needs for data stewards. They also have a survey out at the moment. So if you're interested in work in this area, please do take that survey. And they're looking at developing business cases. So they're doing various case studies at the moment and calling for participants there to take that work forward. And then the other training related one was the interest group on early career and engagement. Now, they were focusing on trying to spread awareness of the mentoring program that they run. They found it a little bit of a challenge at the hybrid plenary. There was low participation in the group. And I think that's maybe because a lot of what they do is kind of peer-to-peer support, and it's really best face-to-face. So they usually run like a drink session where they try and bring people together and assign mentors and try and help people network and understand RDA. So that was one of the observations they'd had in that group as well. So some of the common themes coming out, training for data professionals is definitely strongly needed, and there are many different roles or professions addressed by stewardship. So different data curator or manager or data librarian roles. And from the early career group, obviously mentoring for researchers is key, but they were also thinking about ways to kind of draw more researchers to the plenary. They flagged a potential to connect with other related groups like the co-data schools, because they're training a lot of early career researchers, and maybe that's a way to get them more involved in RDA. Again, in this pathway, several outputs and surveys were promoted. There was quite a lot of activity within the groups, and some of the groups were also discussing where to take their interest groups next. I think that's often quite a common discussion at the plenaries, trying to revise a program of work. So we're kind of just before 25 minutes in. We're actually ahead of schedule, which is excellent. What we wanted to do now, so that we're not just talking at you the whole time, is to open the floor to discussion. I actually can't see the collaborative notes, so I don't know if people have put any questions in there, but you can put questions in the chat. You can also just unmute yourself and join in the discussion. So by all means, turn on your videos if you'd like to. But these were some questions we put forward that might be interesting to get responses to. So based on what we've presented and what you saw of the different pathways, these first 6 that we've presented, how did you find the sessions? Were there some that were more illuminating or more useful for you? Maybe what worked well in them? We've presented quite a lot of new outputs or bits of planned work. Are there particular things you're keen to get engaged in? And I think one of the real benefits of the pathways is that it tries to link up related work. So you can start to see interconnections between the groups and potentially gaps that need to be addressed. And these are often highlighted in the discussion at plenaries. So are there particular gaps that you see or opportunities for more coordination between the groups where they have overlapping remits? And also, as I noted at the start, we've only presented on, less than half of the sessions that were presented in these plenary pathways. So there may be other sessions you attended, things that you found really interesting that you think we should be aware of. So are there other things we've not talked about that should also be noted? So does anyone want to raise a question or a comment, or is there anything in the chat? So I see, yeah, good pathway summaries from Rob, and the survey's been shared, so follow up on that survey. And Connie agreeing it's a very useful summary for someone who's been out of the loop. Yeah, I think you've just recently had a baby, Connie, so congratulations. So yeah, no, it's useful to us as well, actually. As tab members, we don't manage to get to all the sessions, so I've certainly found it useful going through and doing the summaries. Anyone got questions or comments to share?
Hi, that's
Hi.
Anna.
Hi.
Hello, Sarah. We did not see for a couple of years already. I'm very much interested in maintaining high quality of data.
Yeah.
And we have a discussion, including in S3 Digit Group and at the university I belong to, because there is a concern when data are deposited already in storage place or repository, and then someone would like to change something. So the person is given the right to change the data, but then there is an open question: who is going to check the quality of the new data?
Yeah.
So I know it's very theoretical, but at the moment it is very important for our PhD students, actually, who are trying to deposit their experimental data. I'm a physicist, if you remember.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I think actually quite a lot of repository platforms have and also with like the data citation that we have, there's ways to handle this, to do different versions of the data. So if it's reused by another researcher, then you'll have like a derivative data set that's linked and hopefully should cite the original one that's reused. If it's the same researcher who's kind of updating the data at a later time point, then you'll be able to kind of just say this is the next version of this. But I think that question about the quality, it's kind of a joint responsibility. There are some quality checks that the curators can do, to make sure things are properly documented and have sufficient metadata, and that things, are clear enough that, you can actually reuse the data. But I think the quality is often a question for the domain itself. So there's a role for the researcher there to actually assess and judge the quality of the data, more so than the curator in many senses. And there's actually some work going on within EOSC. I think one of the people who'd put forward that BOF on data quality is also a co-chair in an EOSC task force, which is looking at fair metrics and data quality, because within the EOSC context, we're trying to have some basic quality criteria, or, kind of that we can align with our rules of participation eventually. But at the moment, this is in quite a kind of fledgling, doing first scoping exercises. So we're not really at a stage to say these are the criteria people need to meet. But I don't know, Gretchen, if you want to add any observations or...
No, it's I just would like to raise this point, because it's important everyone to think, and if we have a next meeting, we might collect different opinions coming from different cases. But I think that it's really important, because now it is the new tendency. It is a requirement for most of the PhD dissertations, but now we are facing this problem because it's quite difficult, you know, when you have 100 PhD students, it's even difficult for their advisors to check the quality. And that's something which bothers me. I'm not sure that we immediately can find the solution. I don't believe that it is possible, but it will be quite important to sit and consider in different metrics and how to do it. So this was my point. Thank you.
No, I think you brought up an excellent point. And as we go through some of the remaining session summaries, you may see something that an interest group that you could reach out to, but you could also consider this or propose this as maybe a future BOF or session of that nature. But maybe there'll be something that you'll see through the pathway summaries that might you know, relate to this data quality issue. I think it's a really good point, though.
Yeah, excellent. Any other questions or comments, or we can move on? I see you've put your screen on. Yep, go ahead. Sorry, I can't see your name at the moment. Is it Philip?
Hello, Sarah. Good to see you again. Joachim Philipson in Stockholm.
Yeah, Joachim. Yeah, okay. I could remember the Philip bit of your name.
Yeah, you got that part right. I have a question. I don't really know how to frame it, but you both mentioned machine readability or machine actionability came up both as a prerequisite for being fair, especially when it comes to metadata, and also regarding DMPs. I've been involved myself in the EOSC Nordic project on machine actionable DMPs. So I'm supposed to know something about what it means, but actually I've become confused as time passes. I've seen recently that the Swedish National Library defined PDFs as machine readable, a machine readable format. And of course, I mean, with new techniques, with AI and
data mining and stuff,
natural language processing, almost anything can be processed or actioned upon by machines. But I just wonder if this question came up in any of the sessions that you covered. I think we actually need a definition of what do we mean by machine actionability or readability.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. So this year I wasn't actually in the DMP discussion group. I don't know if anyone who's on the call was, but you know, I wouldn't define a PDF as machine readable. I mean, I think, like you say, you know, pretty much anything can be, but we're thinking more about having like a JSON output when we're talking about DMPs or some kind of structured format. But I don't know if anyone else was in a group where this got picked up. Wants to comment? No, it's maybe an interesting thing for the FAIR groups to, you know, trying to define when we're thinking about the implementation of the principles, what do we exactly mean by these different terms when we talk about machine readability? I know within the group that are involved in the DMPs, we've done like well, when I used to be at DCC, we did a I can't remember what the paper was called, but like a 10 points on machine, you know, machine actionable DMPs, and talking about the key principles you should follow. So there we've kind of defined things a bit more and how we've implemented it. We did that with Daniel Meach, and I think we published it in Rio Journal, but I can try and dig out the link. So there we've talked specifically about what we mean in the DMP context. But I think FAIR, because it is quite a high level set of principles, we still need to actually talk more about how we're implementing it and what it means.
Yeah.
I know that, I mean, those involved with fair metrics, like the Fuji tool, for example, they have quite elaborate definitions of or requirements for machine actionability. But I sometimes think that those tend to be too narrow. So I mean, you'll have to try to strike a balance here, find a least common denominator for what is absolutely a minimal standard.
Yeah, what's the minimal level?
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think with all of these metrics tools, we also need to think about what judgments they're making, you know, not just looking at the end score it gives out.
Yeah.
I think time-wise, we should probably move on. So I'm going to move to the next set of pathways, which Gretchen will present. So the first one is around data life cycles.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. And I thought, you know, a couple very good topics to follow up on. So thank you for the feedback in our discussion. With the data life cycles, again, 14 sessions in this pathway, and the focus is on versioning, provenance, citation, and reward. So of these 14 sessions, a few working groups, mostly interest groups, and 4 BOFs. So here's of those, we had quite a few, more than half, I think, provided, or yeah, a little over half summary sessions. So thanks to those in that pathway area. And of those sessions, we're going to include 6 summaries for the breakout in these slides. Okay, beginning with SHARC, the SHARC Sharing Rewards and Credit Interest Group. They have a survey, there's a link here in the slides for people to participate in, and that's, they're trying to find out what are the different expectations and different across all of the RDA research community space, and thinking, how do we reward activities in open science, and how do you know, what are all the factors there? So I encourage people to reach out to that survey, and I'm not sure if there's a link to that in the chat, but you can certainly get it from the slides. For the versioning interest group, there's work continuing on developing data versioning principles, and how do you apply those principles to various use cases, and coming up with recommendations for you know, carrying those into your data versioning practice. So that's a very interesting roadmap area. And with data discovery, they had a lot of lightning talks and looked at all different types of methods for collecting user behavior and examining that to help to improve upon the data discovery mechanisms. And then there's a lot of ongoing work in that interest group for future ideas and planning. The BOF on leveraging data community strengths and high performance computing. If you may remember when we were presenting out some of the summaries in the infrastructure, this interoperability with HPC came up there as well. So there's interest in looking at, should there be an interest group in RDA exploring intersections between HPC, FAIR, and how to move forward with that. So I would encourage anybody that was involved with that BOF or knows more about it to maybe think about this joint interest with some of the people in data infrastructures. And then they're also looking at data science schools and how curricula can be used for identifying collaborative areas there. So moving on to another BOF, evaluation of research. there was a document that was collecting different stories and links that were related to how research is evaluated, particularly in the open science context. And there's also interest there in proposing an RDA interest group. Then with the interest group on science communications, there was further discussion about the interest group charter and what are the roles necessary, looking at that both at the individual researcher level as well as broader roles for the organization and how that fits into science communications. So some of the common themes with this pathway, because there's a lot of different topic areas, and it depends on what stage of the data lifecycle you're looking at. So there's the data versioning, discovery and authentication, and again, this specific topic of HPC. I don't know if this would connect back into a potential future theme related to data quality, but I think there may be some interesting discussions and ideas that can follow on from that. Reward and crediting people, as well as how do we evaluate research in the context of open science. And this all then connects into what are career paths in the area of data life cycles, and how do we communicate, have science communications in this space. Okay, so another pathway is getting into the more specific semantics, ontology, and standardization. And there were 11 sessions in this pathway, 1 BOF, 4 working groups, a joint session, and 5 interest groups. And we had a handful of summaries that were provided. Those 4 summaries, there's a lot, there's a big, there's some movement and take up of this new persistent identifier for instrumentation known as PIDINST, that recommendation coming out. And I think there's an updated version of that metadata schema that is being shared out through RDA. And I know it's been referenced very broadly. There's an associated white paper with that, and other organizations such as DataCite, B2, INST, and schema.org are looking at how this PIDINST schema recommendation may connect into their organizational and standard representations. With the national PID strategies, they actually started mapping out some use cases nationally, and they're going to continue to pursue that along with a how-to guide for looking at things in national levels. There's a working group in maintenance phase, the research metadata schemas working group, and they have a couple outputs that they're updating. Those include the guidelines to research metadata and also crosswalks, and more work on adoption, and is there possible extensions that could be folded back into these outputs. And there is a lot of unanticipated taking up of the group outputs. So I think they're revisiting some of this effort since they're in maintenance phase. With the interest group on sensitive data, there is now a suggestion to provide a forum to have a broader shared understanding of what is meant by sensitive data and coming up with a glossary of terms there. So there's a lot of interest, especially there's the open science, but there's also FAIR, which do intersect, but FAIR can also cover some of aspects of sensitive data. So it'll be interesting to follow up with that. And the common themes for this pathway, we're looking at interoperability and discovery, crosswalking between some of the standards and the RDA outputs, metadata outputs, PID-in schemas, and definitions and terminology that are associated with these areas. And this ongoing work on persistent identifiers and having strategies for how they're used, both at broad levels, high levels, but also down to a very specific fine-grained object level, such as an instrument. Moving on to another pathway. I know this is a lot of talking, so we will have time for discussion soon. So discipline-focused data issues. There were 9 sessions here, and we had a few outputs, summary sessions, 3. One of them was a BOF, but the session here, one of those outputs is going to be was already covered in the Fair Care Trust, but interestingly, we had a couple sessions, and one is this improving global agricultural data is our first community of practice in the RDA. So it's really exciting that we now have a community of practice. They are doing a great job. They had a second annual meeting, which they talked about. Apparently it was very successful. I didn't get to attend this session myself, but they have a new co-chair, which they introduced, but then there's several specific areas and outcomes. There's the World Fair pollination use case, and they're also working on engagement even more broadly across Eastern Europe and looking to RDA to assist with outreach to Asia and the Oceania regions. And they're also beginning to talk about roadmap details. That should be going on sometime now in the interest group. And then with the life science data infrastructures interest group, they showcased infrastructures across a lot of different regions of scale. So there's Elixir in Europe, the H3A BioNet, which is in Africa, USA, and the Australia Biocommons. So really good coverage and across a lot of different RDA communities. And they're looking for feedback for future work topics.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Gretchen. So as we flagged, there was one final pathway which was termed other, but very few selected this. And they'd also selected other thematic pathways. So we've summarized them before. So I'm just going to do a couple of concluding slides, and then we'll open it up to questions or discussion again. One thing we thought was useful to flag is how many BOFs there were and some of the emerging topics that came out of those BOFs. So we've already picked up on some, like data set quality, but we also had ones on evaluating research, a lot around code sharing, terminologies for things like data spaces or data commons, how we classify and have taxonomies for those, AI readiness, complex data citations, ELNs, and community building and FAIR. One thing we're interested to know, and we can maybe pick up on this in questions, is whether these are key topics for you too. And because we're thinking about the plenary pathways, that's our focus today, how do these align well with existing pathways, or do we need new pathways, or should we try and restructure the pathways that we're using? So it'd also be useful to get your feedback on how you found the pathways when you've been at plenaries. Has it been a useful way to kind of navigate the program and find related work? Because that's one of the ways we try and cluster the activity. And then just a few kind of final comments from us. As we mentioned earlier, there were some pathways that had a lot of sessions. So the ones around global infrastructure and environments and fair implementation were very popular pathways. I think they align well with RDA's mission. So we're doing a lot around trying to make sure our data infrastructure works at a global level and trying to align and standardize, and that's a big part of FAIR. As Gretchen mentioned, we also had our first community of practice on agriculture. I think it's quite natural that a first COP is set up around a kind of research discipline, but it'll be interesting to see what other areas do get set up as community of practice, because I think there's a lot of information management professional work happening in RDA too. So would we have a COP on something like data stewardship or some other topic areas that we see that are quite prevalent in RDA? There were BOFs in every single pathway, so there's clearly still a lot of emerging work, and it'll be interesting to see how that aligns with interests, how that aligns with existing groups we have, and how we can bring that new work on board. And I think we highlighted this already, but FAIR was a very cross-cutting theme. There were, even though we had the two pathways around FAIR, care and trust, FAIR cropped up in many other pathways as well, like the data life cycles and the standards. As one of the groups mentioned, it's quite hard. Sometimes you have unanticipated adoption. It's hard to predict who will be using your outputs or for what purpose. And I think that can make it quite hard for groups to know how to get their outputs to the relevant audiences and how to pitch them. So I think that's a useful thing for us to do more thinking about how we can support the groups with their outputs. And many of the groups noted overlap between their remits and others. And I think this is what the pathways help to show as well, the connections between the groups. So there was a desire for a lot more join up. And if you have observations or ideas about how we can support that more, that would be useful to hear too. And then our final questions really to you based on this webinar, have you found that plenary that pathway summary useful that we've given today? Would it be beneficial for us to do this kind of thing at the plenary? We ended up having quite a lot of discussion about this in the morning session, and some ideas came up about how we could do that, but it'd be useful to hear your observations about the pathways as well, whether you were aware of them or whether you found them useful, or this kind of summary of the plenary useful as well. So I'll close it there and then we can open up to questions and discussion. And I see one question had come into the chat, whether a recording is available. This is being recorded. The morning session was as well. And they'll both go online. I think Hillary said tomorrow, but maybe Hillary or...
Yeah, the close of US business tomorrow.
Excellent, thank you. And Rob has said one of the emerging themes he sees in many groups is that fair data is not enough. You need a fully fair environment, data, software, models, instruments, hardware. Yeah, and I think some of the groups had kind of touched on that, when they were looking at fair in the context of software or VREs. It's not just about the object, it's that whole kind of environment in which that object's curated, created, stored, managed, long-term, shared. All of that needs to enable fair and be fair itself as well. So the VRE group were thinking about how a VRE itself can be fair and having the reference architecture. I don't know if you want to speak any more to that comment, Rob. You're very welcome to unmute if you'd like to.
No, yeah, you covered it very well. I think that this is seen in many groups, the fair for instrumentation, fair for software, fair for machine learning. There was a BOF that I didn't provide a summary for on fair's relation to AI. I apologize for not providing.
You're a tab member and no summary. I think reprimands are due.
And even the connections to HPC, HTC environments, I think have an element of this where the hardware and the environment that you land on, the runtime environment, need to be fair also. Having fair data is great, but it's not going to lead to reproducibility. And I think this is coming through in so many groups. There were probably 15 mentions of something along those lines in the presentations. And yeah, I just wanted to make that point that it seems to be an emerging theme. Maybe we should consider a fair environments pathway in the future where we can group these things together also.
Yeah, no, that's a nice idea, actually. I think one thing we could maybe do within TAB as well is kind of looking at the kind of program or the sessions retrospectively to get a sense of how else could we have tagged them, what other pathways could potentially have been used, because we define the pathways before people submit. so that they can select the pathways and make it easier for us to program. But it might be good. Yeah, I think then people have to pigeonhole themselves into a certain structure. So maybe that's something we could look at as well, to think about potential pathways for future.
Very good. And since I'm from the tab and we can discuss this, I'll be quiet and let people on the tab actually offer opinions.
Yeah, and there's a comment as well from Lindsay in the chat. Sorry, I'll just scroll back up. I think there's a lot of potential for many of the new BOF groups to adopt some of the existing working group outputs for creating an open working collection of use case adoptions from working groups. Yeah, I think definitely.
And a question Lindsay has toward the end.
Yeah. Where can we catalog our unanticipated adoptions?
That's a great question.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we do have, like, I think within Secretariat, there is specific, do you still have an outputs and adoption officer,
Yes.
or is it? Yeah.
Oh, no, we don't.
No.
Not at the moment. Not at the moment. No, we are, but we do have adoption pages. So we do invite the groups to send us details about the adoption so that we can add it to the adoption part and link it onto their group page as well. And we can work through as well different adoption scenarios if the group has something and they wish to communicate it and don't know how. All is possible.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Joachim's put a suggestion about future adoption of RDA outputs or standards. Maybe we could have some kind of web form where people can report, you know, on adopting or reusing something, so that it's easier for us to kind of gather that information.
Could I ask a question, because I saw it to Lindsay, because I saw it in the notes as well. Can someone tag commonalities at the, what exactly do you mean by that?
So I guess, yeah, Lindsay, maybe you can unmute, but are you thinking about, can we all kind of add tags to existing content in the RDA collection? I don't know that Zenodo lets you do that.
So I do believe that they do. I've done it with some working collections of my own, but it's manual. So as long as there's a URI that's associated with that word, like it has to have an ontology attachment, you know, you can put, you know, hardware or software or data or citation. So you can do that. And I think what would be interesting is you can filter on those tags when the collection is large enough. And so let's say I don't know across all the different outputs, you know, what pertains to me specifically with what I'm looking for. So it's kind of like a way to get around the query aspect.
Yeah,
and that would be really
interesting.
cool.
Yeah, that sounds
So
really
it's almost
helpful.
a RDA taxonomy of sorts.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Maybe in the last minute that we have, it's a good time to say that we are about to embark on a rather expensive and rather huge web platform redesign and restructuring. And part of the solution that we have chosen has this underlying semantics taxonomies and all these different ontology solutions that we require to help to improve this whole, how would you say, you know, that everything is, it's not just about giving you a collaborative space as community members, but also about weaving the web between them in a more automated way, but it goes beyond that. So at the moment we do have a catalogue where you can see the outputs and the recommendations, but there's a lot of manual work that goes on behind the web platform. This web platform will be ready though at the end of this year. But it is, I mean, Zenodo will remain. I don't mean that it's going to replace that or anything, but it definitely should help us. So
yeah, sounds good. Yeah, exciting new work.
So I just put the link and I'll put it in the notes. That's where you can actually see all the, so if you want to find out all the outputs and recommendations, if you click that link, you get them at the moment at the catalogue. It has a fairly reduced, what's that word? Search feature, but it's there.
But I mean, even if we're able to tag in the meantime, I didn't realize you could do that within Zenodo, but if you're able to add tags to existing collections, that would be nice. And the web platform will certainly help as well.
Yeah. So we are wrapping up to the end of our hour here.
Yeah.
So do we have any last minute question, or should we just close out? Because I know some people are starting to.
Can I
Yeah,
take
need to
30 seconds, if that's okay,
Yeah,
just
of
to
course.
tell
Go for it.
everybody, and
Yeah,
not
go
you
ahead,
too,
Hillary.
that I would like to remind you all that the Technical Advisory Board is a fully volunteer board. So we are really grateful to particularly Sarah, Gretchen and Ming, but all the TAB members for putting together this webinar, which I believe, and discussion as well. And clustering, I know they invested a serious amount of in time to do this, and I think it's been appreciated by the community, but definitely by us. And we are very grateful for that, because it's a lot of time away from your day job.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
thank
no,
you.
it's been interesting to do. It's always, you never manage to catch everything at a plenary, so it's good to do this kind of thing just to get that summary and to find new links of things you want to follow up. So for us, it's beneficial too.
Yeah, definitely.
Excellent.
Happy to support it.
Yeah. Thank you all for attending, and
Yeah.
enjoy your daytimes or evenings or whatever you're going on to next, and see you all soon.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you
Thank
so much.
you.
Thank you very
Okay.
much. It was really
Bye-bye.
grateful. Bye-bye.
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 Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.